Hi, my name is Cameron Miller, and this is a reflection on the 25th week of Pentecost from the readings from the Revised Common Lectionary, and this is Trinity Place in Geneva, New York. So, 37 or 38 years after Jesus was executed, the Roman army reduced the temple in Jerusalem to ruins and conducted a campaign to eradicate Jews from Judah and Galilee and the region all around them. They set fire to the temple, and it is said that it burned so intensely that the stones themselves caught fire. The only thing that remains today is the Western Wall, often called the Wailing Wall, which rests underneath the Muslim Haram Sharif, or noble sanctuary. Chapter 13 in the Gospel of Mark, from which we read a piece today, is one of the primary internal elements through which scholars date that gospel. The majority of gospel scholars still ascribe a date of about 70 CE to the text that was anonymously written but universally referred to as Mark. The destruction of the temple dates it. In other words, Mark is standing on the other side of the rubble from Jesus, and he's looking back across recent history, back across the Roman Empire, for he's writing his gospel in Greek from as far away as Rome itself, and certainly no closer than Antioch in modern-day Syria. Even the literary form that we know as gospel appears to be an ancient Greek and Roman genre. As I've said before, the destruction of the temple, which Mark has Jesus predict almost 40 years before it happens, is the very dividing line between before and after. For Judaism and everybody related to it, the world before and the world after the destruction of the temple was as much a distinction as between night and day. Everything had changed. The Gospel of Mark was written on the knife's edge between before and after. It's believed that Mark wrote his Gospel in the year 70, or very soon after, as the smoke was still clearing, and it was as yet unclear how the world would be different, but that it would be. Now, why am I telling you all this? Well, I have a confession to make. When I'm working on a sermon and I'm having a difficult time figuring out where it's going or if it's going anywhere, I will distract myself with history. I'll read it all over again. I'll read about the periods and the people and the scholarship I've read about so many times before. It's a black hole I can fall into, which I did multiple times this week because I'm stuck. Honestly, I am stuck. The best I can do is tell you where I traveled before I got stuck. Now, every story has an ending, but like beginnings, not all endings are equal. Our culture here in the United States is spun from the threads of happy ending stories. Whether old westerns or political mythologies, animated heroes or rom-coms, we rarely, if ever, tell a story that does not have a happy ending, at least not in the popular culture. And that's because, I theorize, that the other thing about our stories that we tell is that they are all mostly commercialized, told for the purpose of making money or contributing to power. Happy endings sell better than unhappy ones, since consumers like to feel good after they've bought something. Still, every story does have an ending of one kind or another. We tend to think of the gospel as ending with the resurrection, a kind of tortured happy ending, literally tortured happy ending. But that's not how Jesus chose to end the story of his public ministry in the Gospel of Mark and Luke and Matthew. Actually, the way I should say that is that in each of those Gospels, the editor or storyteller chose to use this as the final story that Jesus told publicly. Jesus, of course, did not write or dictate the Gospels. Mark, Luke, and Matthew did. And for some reason, I don't think it's even clear why, for some reason the story of Jesus talking about the temple and the apocalypse was the last public story they had Jesus tell. There were numerous stories about Jesus going forward, but this was the last public story Jesus told. Now, this is a very important aspect of the gospel, I think. It's one that we almost never talk about. Jesus' last public story in each of the synoptic gospels is the one about the destruction of the temple. It's the prelude to a story about the end of time, and it's a pretty doggone dark story, not a happy ending story. In all three gospels, the last story Jesus tells is provoked by some knucklehead oogling at the temple, and exclaiming, "Oh, how beautiful it is." Something about that sends Jesus into this darkened depths to forecast what's going to happen at the end of time when God is out of patience and human beings run out of options. Jesus was living close to the end. He knew it. And he knew that his companions were living close to their end too. I'm guessing that was a terrible grief. A terrible grief that plagued his thoughts and filled his heart. So when someone made a stray comment about, oh, the beauty of the stained glass windows, or those lovely angels at the apex of the roof beams, all that emotion came gushing out. Of course, that was a description of a church, not the temple. But let's step back from Jesus for just a moment and think about the temple and the thousands and thousands of people who were in awe of it, who adored it, who paid whatever they had to pay to use it, to be part of it, and to support it. Never mind that it was built and maintained by a coercive system of religious taxation, not all that different from the corruption of paying indulgences that Rome created a few centuries later. For tens of thousands of people, the temple was the one place on earth where God resided. It was holy. In the most profound sense of that word, it was holy. And at the center of it, the Holy of Holies. Still today, just the ruins of it is considered by some to be that kind of holy. For Jesus to predict it dismantling, to mock it even, some might say, would have been deeply disturbing. But somehow, while others valued and adored it, Jesus was able to keep his perspective about it. It was a trifle, a mote, a bit of dust in God's scheme of things, rather than the center of the universe. If we're being honest with ourselves, you and I have many times put our passions and our belief and our loyalty into the wrong things. We probably continue to do so. Surely there was once or twice that something we thought was so important that we overcommitted ourselves to it. Or something or someone was trusted more than we should have. But at the time, we could not be dissuaded from our idealized view. Wasn't there something or someone we stood in awe of, only to discover it was not quite as awesome as we had imagined? At those times, was there someone among our friends or family poking at us to stand back and to take another look? Was there someone prodding us to keep a more critical eye? And didn't they make us so angry? My point is that idolatry is alive and well in the 21st century, in you and in me. The value of things we happen to love gets inflated to such a degree that we lose perspective. We begin to ascribe to them a sacredness that should be reserved only for God and for what God loves. Now, that's not to say that what we care about is unimportant or should be dismissed willy-nilly, but rather that we need to keep them in perspective. Well, that right there is where I got stuck. Maybe that's just as good a place to get stuck as any. We're still under the shroud of a pandemic. And while we may feel a lot safer having been vaccinated, we know it can still be dangerous, and we know that many others continue to be in harm's way. We know the economy hasn't recovered fully, and we don't know when it will. How do we stop? How can we stop and breathe and gain perspective again? Likewise, in this I think I can speak for nearly every side and angle of our current polarized political culture when I say that the swirling conflicts around us get to be overwhelming and makes everything feel precarious and vulnerable, where just a few years ago it all felt predictable and endlessly ongoing. How do we stop, breathe, and gain perspective again? I don't know exactly. Probably different for all of us. But I'll remind us what Jesus did in that moment, that perhaps he needed a little perspective. And it's a little risky to mention it, even though it's right there in the Gospel of Mark, because some people really won't like the implications of this. But what Jesus does at that moment, the very next thing, after talking about the temple and talking about the apocalypse, Jesus goes to the house of a close friend and is there surrounded by other close friends who share a meal together, a very Jesus thing to do. It's the gathering of his community, his spiritual community, and his actual community. It's a time, it says in the gospel, when they talk about what's next. Where will they go? What will they do? What's their vision of the next thing? And in the midst of that dinner, and in the midst of that conversation, someone, Mark doesn't name her, brings oil and gives Jesus a massage. Now that seems like a pretty good metaphor to me for how to get perspective when we need it. To place ourselves in the arms of community and to do the things that we know will care for our wounds. Like I said, it's hard to know where to go with a guy ranting about the end of time and predicting the destruction of what everyone believed was sacred. So the place I went was exactly where Jesus did, into the arms of community and allowing himself to receive love and tenderness in their arms. Well, that's all I got, except to wish you a great deal of peace and healing.